So good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this webinar on a just transition, supporting the shift to environmental sustainability. I'm Benita, I'm a former UK civil servant, and I'm delighted to be chairing this webinar on behalf of Global Government Forum and our knowledge partner today, Deloitte. As you will have seen, we are offering today's webinar in translation into Spanish and Italian. We will remind you of how to do this throughout the webinar, but you should see at the bottom of your device, or maybe it's at the top, depending what you're using, there's an interpretation button. If you click on that, you will be able to select Spanish or Italian today. So in terms of today's topic, addressing climate change, I think is probably the biggest challenge, it's fair to say, facing governments around the world. And many have already committed to reducing their reliance on fossil fuels, prioritizing environmentally friendly activities, and protecting the Earth's biodiversity. But this green transition will bring big changes for traditional industries, workforces, and communities. And it's going to affect the way we all work and live our lives. It's becoming increasingly clear that governments need to support citizens and businesses through this shift to a sustainable future, developing and implementing a range of dedicated policies and initiatives to ensure that, in particular, the most vulnerable are not hit hardest as economies are decarbonised. So in a minute, we're going to talk about all of those issues and more, and we've got a really fantastic stellar panel with us here today who I'm going to introduce in a moment. But there will also be time, once we've heard from our panel, to take questions from you, our audience today. So on whichever device you're using, you should see a Q&A function. Please, at any point from now on, use that Q&A function to send in your questions, and we'll get through as many of those as we can before the end of the webinar. And as I say, we've got such a great panel with us today. Please do take this opportunity to send in your questions. So without further ado, let me introduce our panel today. First, we will hear from Samantha Smith. Samantha is the director of the Just Transition Centre, a centre that's working for a just transition for workers and communities. The centre was established by the International Trade Union Confederation and its partners to help unions and their allies get good plans for just transition at all levels. Previously, Samantha was the global climate and energy leader for WWF, the world's largest conservation organisation. Then we'll hear from Sarah Collenbrander, who is director of the Climate and Sustainability Programme at the Overseas Development Institute. As an environmental economist, Sarah supports policymakers across Asia, Africa, and Latin America to develop low-carbon development strategies with a focus on low-carbon cities, sustainable finance, and just transition. Then we'll hear from Bernard Lorenz, who is managing partner and global leader for climate strategy at Deloitte. Bernard has dedicated his career over the past 3 decades to 2 major goals: decarbonisation of industries and improvement of the quality of public service. Prior to joining Deloitte, Bernard was managing partner at the Climate Neutrality Foundation. Then we'll go over to the World Bank and we'll hear from Louise Cord, who is Global Director for Social Sustainability and Inclusion at the World Bank. Previously, Louise held various positions in the World Bank's Poverty Reduction and Sustainable Development departments, working specifically on inclusive growth, poverty reduction, and rural development across Africa, Latin America, as well as Eastern and Central Europe. And last, but by no means least, we will hear from Sabrina Muller, who is a policy analyst on sustainable finance at the Grantham Research Institute in the London School of Economics. Sabrina works on sustainable finance policy with a particular focus on the just transition in both developed and developing countries. A key strand of her work is the coordination of the UK's Financing a Just Transition Alliance, and I'm sure we'll hear more of that in Sabrina's presentation. So that's our brilliant panel today. As I said, please do send in your questions and we'll get through as many of those as we can. But for now, I'm going to invite Samantha to give us her opening remarks. Over to you, Samantha.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thanks everyone for getting together for this conversation about just transition. So just to say a little bit more about the International Trade Union Confederation where I work, we are the global union federation for most of the world's unions, and we represent more than 200 million organized workers, formal and informal, in 163 countries. As you said, we were set up, the Just Transition Center was set up by the ITUC to help unions implement the Paris Agreement and the ILO guidelines on just transition, which I'll get to in just a moment. We work mostly with unions and other social partners in high emitting countries and high emitting sectors, more or less evenly divided at this point between developed and developing countries. And we also work with unions at different levels: national, city and state, province, company and sector, and sometimes with investors. Just to say a few of the places where we're working a lot this year: South Africa, of course, India, Indonesia, Canada, the United States, Colombia, Brazil, Australia, New Zealand, and across the EU, and of course the United Kingdom. When we talk about just transition in the union movement, we're talking about what has been negotiated in the United Nations and what is in the Paris Agreement. So many people are excited about the term just transition without necessarily having gone deeply into what it means or what has already been negotiated. But what has been negotiated is that the International Labor Organization, which is a tripartite UN body involving governments, employers, and workers in our organizations, so mostly trade unions, but where workers are informal and not allowed to organize into unions, they will sometimes form associations of informal workers. But so you have these three parties in the ILO, and in 2015, they negotiated, after a lengthy process involving expert working groups and lots of discussions, they negotiated these global rules for just transition, which I'll drop a link to them in the chat. And you see these ILO guidelines reflected in the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, which is sort of our big foundation for action on climate that we're all trying to implement. The Paris Agreement refers to the imperative of the just transition of the workforce and the creation of decent work and quality jobs. So from this, you can probably see that the key issues in a just transition, again, under this UN architecture, which has been added to in this now 7 years almost since the Paris Agreement was negotiated, the key point is about the world of work and about what are called the social partners. So that is 1, governments; 2, workers in our organizations; and 3, employers. And if you don't have certainly employers and unions at the table negotiating the just transition, then it is actually not a just transition. It's something else that might be great, but it is not just transition. So one thing to know about just transition is that it has these process requirements. And I think the other thing to know about just transition is that it's both about the measures that are going to help workers who today are working in high emitting sectors to get to new good jobs. It's about creating decent jobs, making sure the new jobs are good jobs, but also about making sure that people have social protection so that they have unemployment insurance, they have quality public services, they get the skills and training that they need, and so on. I think the last thing I'd just like to highlight is what we as trade unions would like to see you as governments do, right? Because as I mentioned, governments are one of the 3 social partners who are in tripartite social dialogue, which is the backbone of just transition. So what we hope for from any government is, first, that you will respect labor rights. There is no just transition without labor rights. There is no just transition without organized labor. Second, that you will convene, carry out, and implement tripartite social dialogue, as I mentioned, the backbone of just transition. Third, that you will invest in just transition, that you will create just transition funds or contribute to climate finance that is going to assist other countries in getting a just transition. Fourth, that you will have national jobs plans for quality jobs that bring down emissions, again, negotiated in social dialogue. And then finally, just to remember that just transition is about jobs, it is about social protection, it is about rights, but it's also about alleviating poverty. So it must be possible, because we're seeing it happen in quite a few countries now, that while doing something meaningful about climate change, governments, employers, investors are actually creating good new jobs with rights and making sure that people have social protection through the transition. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Samantha. What a great way to start. I mean, the things that you say there will be a real call to action, I think, for our audience, who are primarily civil servants, public servants from around the world. Really good to hear you remind everybody that these things aren't a nice to have. They're actually in the agreements. They are part of what has been agreed and what has already been negotiated. And that real kind of stress, this is not just about jobs, although that's hugely important, but also that social support networks and the quality of public services. And then really nice to have your 5 kind of key things there at the end. So everything from respecting labour rights and making sure the right people are around the table, but also that hugely important there, alleviating poverty. So a really lovely way for us to start. Thank you, Samantha. And now I'm going to invite Sarah to give us her thoughts.
Thank you very much, Siobhan. And thank you to Global Government Forum for organising the discussion, and to all of you for making the time to attend. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm really glad to be following on from Sam, who I've heard speak before and always provides a fantastic and articulate introduction to the origins of the just transition thinking and how much it's evolved, driven very substantially by the work of labour movements and unions in particular. I think the reason I'm pleased to follow on from Sam is that she's opened the door to a broader way of thinking about just transitions, which are often by necessity defined in terms of the major winners and losers of that shift to a low carbon and climate resilient world. And the most obvious group who are at risk of being left behind are the workers that Sam referred to. I think a just transition also offers us an opportunity to think more comprehensively about the world we're trying to build and whether that is or is not a more just place, which depends, of course, partially but not wholly upon the labour movement. I think a really striking thing to think about is when we envision a lower carbon society, in many ways, that is a better and a fairer place to live. A world that is powered by clean energy should also have cleaner air. And we know that air quality is one of the great scourges of public health, particularly, but not solely, during a respiratory pandemic. We know that energy insecurity that comes with volatile international commodity markets is a threat, not only to fuel poverty and to the cost of living, but also, as we've seen recently, to peace and stability around the world. And we know that in some countries that are fossil fuel rich, that dependence on those resources has enabled autocracies to rise and to exclude democratic participation. And so a conversation about a transition to clean energy, to more efficient land use, to greener cities and so on, should also think very broadly, not only about how we protect and support those who might be left behind in that process of structural change, but how we use that momentum to build altogether a fairer and better world for those people. And when we face that challenge, I think when we see that opportunity, I think we immediately also see a difficult challenge emerge. On the one hand, a just transition creates this opportunity to have better jobs, cleaner air, greater energy security, more democratic participation, and so on. On the other hand, we know that fossil fuels generate a huge amount of rents, huge amount of resources that offer a source of power to a tiny proportion of actors within society, whether that's state-owned enterprises and politicians, powerful corporates, or whoever it might be, and that they will oppose a transition, in some cases with misinformation and with violence. At a global scale, we see that fossil fuel-rich states are often, though not always, more autocratic, more violent, and more fragile. And consequently, we see this real challenge where, on the one hand, having a stable, peaceful, and managed transition might demand finding ways to work with those elites who have been barriers to change and to the transition in the past, and at the same time, finding ways to seize the opportunities that come from decarbonisation, and to use the new technologies, the new systems and processes that emerge in response to the climate crisis to deliver better and more just outcomes for all. And I think that's a place where there's a huge amount to learn from the labour movement and other social movements. The idea of working collectively together to envision and co-produce alternative pathways, alternative development pathways, taking incremental steps at a time is really key to this. I think as Sam outlined, a critical element of a just transition is not only your distributive outcomes at the end, but the procedures that you take as well and who is invited into the room. Workers are, of course, a big part of that, but in many countries, it will also be, for example, your urban poor, your farmers, other groups who may be left behind anyway by current injustices, and the process of a transition offers an opportunity to redress some of those historical imbalances. And so I think as civil servants, in some countries, the process of a just transition is already one, in Germany and South Africa, that seeks to be inclusive, to amplify different voices, and to address some of those past inequalities. And there's an opportunity for civil servants at the forefront of this as new justice transition forums and processes are created to ensure that they do serve that broader process, focusing not just on a narrow and highly visible problem, although that is the most urgent one to address, but seizing those broader opportunities to use low carbon change for the better. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And building on what Sam said in her initial presentation, really loads of food for thought there about that really big opportunities here to create a different type of future. As you say, opportunities around kind of things like cleaner air comes from cleaner energy, but also that raising that really important issue of how do we make sure this transition happens in a way that's peaceful and that's stable when you're going to get some of these big powerful players who are going to oppose some of the changes that are required. And like Samantha as well, stressing the need to make sure that all voices are in the room and that all voices are heard, and the importance of collaboration and partnership working. Thank you so much, Sarah. Two fantastic presentations to kick us off. And I'm sure we're not going to be disappointed by our third. Bernard, over to you for your opening remarks.
Well, that's you raised the bar. Thank you very much, Jovan. I hope not to disappoint. Thank you very much for the Global Government Forum that you do this important panel discussion. And I very much appreciate both Sam and Sarah introducing their views on this. And I can agree with everything they said, particularly with regards to both aspects of this, which are particularly important for me, which is that we have a big challenge, major challenges in the global south, but we are facing, and Sarah, you just mentioned this, very structural challenges with regard to the decarbonization, particularly now with the acceleration of this transformation already in mature economies like my home country, Germany, where we have kind of in a laboratorium, in a nutshell, many of the developments that we will see in the foreseeable future, Sam, I think in the global south in particular. That's why we can use this to learn again something which we learned the last 20 years when we turned down the cost curves for the renewables in the energy transformation already in Germany. And I think there's much to learn from this first phase. I do think that with what I'm doing today, which is globally looking into industry in particular, and also into my old friends in the policy arena, to support the green transformation and to accelerate and make really use and leverage out of what we do in Germany, I think in Europe in particular, being a little bit ahead of the curve with regard to the regulatory development and to the development that the financial industry is driving. I can see that there will not be any success story from sector to sector, and referred Sarah to some of the how to abode sectors already, without aspects of just transition. And I see more and more in the boardrooms where I discuss this, and that brings me back from my old time when I was more on the activist side and I had served in 2 administrations in Germany for the German Greens, that there is a clear understanding more and more not in all industries, not in all boardrooms, but more and more, that there is no success story of this transformation without a just transition aspect, as Samantha just pointed out, with the role of social partners. I mean, that's easy to say in a state like Germany, where we have social partners, where we have a very, I would say, corporate capitalism with this tradition of social welfare states. But I think even with global players, they understand increasingly that there is no way out to taking responsibility in this. Is this where we can sit down and watch and see? No, we have to fight for this every day. And at Deloitte, we have a very clear opinion that we work with clients only when they really accept to have the serious aspect and the other trust transitional aspects of the transformation as well, and agree on fundamental values and rules-based systems in this field. But I think that we can observe that we are on the right track. If I reflect a little bit on some of the discussions that I had around the corporate world, COP26, around the big pledges, both in the methanol things and in coal in South Africa. You referred to South Africa as well, Sarah. I do think that the train is, let me say, going in the right direction. We have to fight hard to get particularly some sectors with regard to oil and gas, mining and metals, get them on board. But I think it's now really a phase where we can showcase, particularly in countries like Germany, that there is only one way, and that has to be a just way. And traditionally, of course, unions are strong here, Sam. So that could be something where we can hopefully have an example for successful just transition. Final comment from my side, I think that the Ukraine crisis puts a lot of pressure on this, with rising energy prices, with all the discussions about sanctions that affect a lot of the costs for lower income classes in particular. So there will be much more pressure on this, even I think in the next, like we say, 12 to 18 months. And it will be very, very interesting, absolutely mission critical to get the right choices done, particularly in the EU in this field. Thank you very much. Back to you.
Thanks so much, Bernard. Really nice to have a slightly different perspective there. It's nice to hear what you're saying from your own experience, that you feel like the train is going in the right direction, that the conversations you've been having with companies, but also with policymakers, is showing that people are increasingly considering the issue of just transition. I really like the phrase that you said there, there's only one way, and that has to be the just way. I think that's good. But equally, your note of caution there, two notes of caution, even in countries like Germany, which could be role models for others, you're still having to fight for this in some areas. There are some sectors that are still slower than others. And one thing that we can all be sure about is the world is an uncertain place. And so things like Ukraine or the pandemic can easily knock things off course. So your word of caution there, that we have to make sure that even in these turbulent times, the right decisions are still made. So thank you so much, Bernard. I'm now going to ask Louise. Over to you, Louise.
Thank you so much. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here today, part of the Global Government Forum, and to join this discussion on just transition. I want to start by highlighting what is social sustainability and the importance of social sustainability for the just transition. Social sustainability happens when people feel part of the development or change process and believe that it will benefit them and their descendants. There's been a lot of attention placed in recent years on economic sustainability and more recently on environmental sustainability, but less has been on social sustainability, which is an important part of the triad. Societies that are socially sustainable are more cohesive, inclusive, and resilient. And decisions are made in a way that is perceived as fair and legitimate, where all may benefit over time and thrive. In these societies, people are more effective in coming together to deal with global challenges such as pandemics, or climate change, fragility. Increasingly, we are coming to see at the World Bank that social sustainability is critical for poverty reduction, but also critical as we try to overcome together global challenges such as climate change. My point today is to emphasize that social sustainability needs to guide our policies for just transition. And I think I'm very much in line with my previous speakers, just as much as environmental and economic sustainability. And in fact, as I've heard in the recurrent theme, not addressing social sustainability can and will stem progress towards our climate goals. But okay, so what does that mean for us in practice? I'll focus on the energy transition, but some of the lessons I'll highlight are also relevant for the food, urban, and transport transitions that need to happen as well. They're based on the World Bank's experiences in coal mine closures, 11 lending operations across several countries in Eastern and Central Europe, and nearly $3 billion worth of lending, as well as the experiences and case studies coming from the United States, from Germany, United Kingdom, and China. What we found is that the technical challenges of coal mine closures are complex, but manageable, but that ignoring the social dimensions can block progress. Moreover, providing subsidies, severance payments, cash payments, relocation packages are important, but not sufficient to address the full range of social issues. A new World Bank report just released, Global Perspectives on Coal Jobs and Managing Labor Transition Out of Coal, highlights that millions of direct and indirect jobs will be lost with the just transition, and that this will have large ripple effects on communities that can create social instability. We know that coal mining regions tend to be poor, with deep inequalities and unemployment, and characterized often by multi-generational economic reliance on coal. To fully understand the challenges, it is important to start to engage early with communities, and not just the miners, but also the indirect suppliers, the informal workers, non-state actors, the private sector, youth leaders, trade unions, persons with disabilities, women's groups, indigenous peoples, etc. This requires clearly mapping out who are the stakeholders at the community and at the national level who will be impacted, and putting in place real citizen engagement opportunities to make sure that all voices are heard. It also implies carrying out social assessments to understand what will be the distributional impact, analyzing the labor impacts, analyzing the indirect impacts across members of the community. In this line, we're working with governments in South Africa to assess some of the social impacts of the transition and to support, in one case, coal plant closure. We're also working, for example, in Indonesia on stakeholder mapping and further assessments of the distributional impacts of coal transitions in that country. Also really critical is to strengthen partnerships between communities and local governments and the private sector to explore how you're going to finance the coal transition, including options such as benefit sharing, working with the private sector, and of course, fiscal transfers from the central government. In India, we're working very closely with the private sector and local governments to look at the options for benefit sharing to finance the just transition that needs to happen. In Indonesia, we're looking at economic and social, environmental and social good governance practices to see how to work with the private sector to support communities during the coal transition. Third is building economic and regional infrastructure that goes beyond just the community, but opens up new opportunities. So infrastructure, broadband, that will allow the development of new industries, preferably green industries. There's a clear lessons that emerges from Germany in this experience, which has done some very good regional development programs, as well as experiences in the United States from Appalachia, which have been more community driven and look within the regional context. We are working ourselves on concepts called smart villages, also to provide packages of infrastructure to communities to broaden their economic opportunities. But in all this process, it's critical to do the monitoring and evaluation. Millions, billions will flow into the just transition in the years to come, and monitoring to make sure that this money and resources actually reaches those who are the most directly impacted will be critical. Let me just wrap up by saying clearly a focus on social sustainability is one piece, albeit a necessary piece of an integrated approach that is needed to accelerate the just transition. At the World Bank, we have a whole of society approach that focuses on people and communities, but also on institutional governance, laws, financing, institutional structures, and environmental remediation and repurposing of the mining assets. Obviously, it's a team effort and an integrated approach that's needed. Finally, climate change poses a major threat to our goal of eradicating poverty. Poor countries we know are paying a higher price in terms of losses caused by the impact of climate change, and we know the most vulnerable are the most impacted. we as a global community, it's great to see panels like this where we are coming together to tackle the climate crisis and poverty and inequality, which are also intertwined. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Louise. Again, really good to have that different perspective, to hear what the World Bank is doing on the social sustainability in particular issue, and really interesting to hear those lessons learned from the coal mine closures. So some of the things you said there, the importance of early engagement with the wider communities, and just the importance of understanding who is affected. So the stakeholder analysis, the stakeholder mapping, the role of the private sector as well as the public sector in support going forward, investment in new infrastructure and new green opportunities. And then I think really important, the audience might want to come back to this as well, is how do you monitor the effectiveness of investment in this just transition? Because a lot of money is going to be going into this in the future. Thank you so much for that. Before I come to Sabrina, our final opening presentation, just a reminder to the audience, if some people joined a few minutes late after the start, if you would like to listen to this webinar in Spanish or Italian, you can choose that by going to the interpretation icon that will be on your screen somewhere, and you will have the opportunity to choose Italian or Spanish if you would prefer that to English. But now, without further ado, over to Sabrina for our final presentation. Thank you very much, Sabrina.
Thanks a lot, Shaban, and thanks for having me today. Delighted to be here. Feel free to go to the next slide, Alexa, thanks. So complementary to what's been said by my fellow panelists already, the just transition is not a new concept. It was included as a single line in the Paris Agreement already. And in the past couple years, it has really climbed up the agenda of both policymakers and the private sector, with important advances made also at COP26 in Glasgow last year, which has elevated the just transition as a key strategy for delivering ambitious climate action. How we at the LSE often frame it, if net zero is the what, the just transition is the how. Now, net zero has the potential to bring significant social benefits, such as creating good quality jobs that uphold human and labor rights, but this needs conscious planning and strategic work. Governments have the primary responsibility to deliver a just transition, but they can't do it alone. Financial institutions also have an important part to play, both in terms of mobilizing finance for the just transition and also incentivizing businesses to act on the social risks and opportunities of climate ambitions. I think we would probably all agree that the just transition is the right thing to do. A key part of it is upholding established social, labor, and human rights standards and ensuring we deliver on the positive social impact potential of the move to a net zero and resilient economy. But the strategic rationale for financial institutions to support a just transition goes beyond that too. It's also the necessary thing to do. Without taking into account the social dimension, there's a real chance of social backlash, which could lead to a delayed or more costly shift to net zero, and that in turn translates into financial risks. And it's also the smart thing to do, because by taking a people-centered approach and supporting to develop the essential skills, capabilities, and social institutions needed for a successful transition, financial institutions are supporting human and social capital, which in turn brings benefits for financial institutions as well. Next slide, please. Now, what are the levers finance institutions can use to make a difference? Financial institutions can support the just transition in 5 key ways. The first is strategy and leadership, so integrating the just transition into strategic documents and policies which build the basis for their decision making. Then engagement, which covers shareholder engagement of investors with corporate managers and also client relationships of banks. Capital allocation, so shifting financing to those companies which deliver positive social impacts for workers, communities, and consumers in the net zero transition. Fourth is policy dialogue, another important one, engaging with local and national policymakers to lay out the frameworks that will support financial institutions to scale up their just transition efforts. And lastly, delivering impact and measuring contribution, because ultimately It's about bringing about real improvement in people's lives, and the credibility of just transition action will be improved by showing how real-world outcomes are achieved. Next slide, please. Financial institutions are starting to recognize their role in delivering a just transition, with important first steps being taken. Investors are leading among financial institutions on supporting the just transition, with shareholder engagement having had the greatest success so far in terms of real action. The prime example here is the Scottish energy company SSE, who developed the first dedicated company just transition plan in response to engagement with Royal London Asset Management and Friends Provident Foundation. So a clear link between a prompt from investors and progress being made by a company in response to that. Another example of this finance sector recognition for the just transition is the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, with its over 450 members with over 130 trillion of assets under management, because they have included the just transition as best practice of both real economy and finance sector transition plans. But as is often the case, the recognition and commitment to the just transition is there, but there's not a lot of detail on how to operationalize this. So how to translate the commitment into action. That's something that we're currently working on quite intensively at the LSE to provide guidance on what a good climate transition plan that incorporates the social dimension looks like. And this is going to become more and more relevant over the next couple of years as more and more businesses and financial institutions develop their climate plans, which is also prompted by policy sometimes. In the UK, for example, listed companies and certain investors will be required to publish transition plans by 2023. And if we manage to anchor the just transition in core guidance for these transition plans, they are bound to be a key tool to embed the just transition in corporate and financial decision making. And looking at the time, I think I'm going over my allocated 5 to 6 minutes already. So let me wrap up here by saying it's really essential that the public and private sectors work together to achieve a just transition. The public sector can't stem the financing challenge alone, and in turn, policy can also provide favorable conditions for finance, for example, through regulation and clear policy pathways, which can lead private financial institutions to scale up their efforts. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Sabrina. I think that's a really nice place to end the opening presentations on that importance of working together across the public and the private sectors. The public sector can't do this alone. Really good to see, in the same way that Bernard was saying, these conversations are becoming increasingly familiar in policy circles. As you were saying, the financial institutions are getting more and more on board with this agenda. Good to see you set out the 5 ways they could help there, everything from showing leadership to allocation of capital towards greener activities. And then how the public sector can help, again, that will be interesting from our audience, by setting a kind of regulatory framework and other ways that are kind of encouraging and requiring the private sector to play their part in this agenda as well. So thank you so much to our fantastic panel for those opening comments. They've given loads of food for thought, and we've already got lots of questions coming in from the audience. I just want to kick off the conversation with a couple of questions of my own. I'm going to put these to all of you on the panel. You can choose to answer one or both of my questions before we go to questions from the audience. So I think my 2 questions are, you've all mentioned the need for just transitions, and Samantha, you mentioned the fact that it's already been negotiated, it's in the agreements. Who's going to hold governments to account if they don't do this, if they don't take account of a just transition? So essentially, who's keeping governments accountable for this? And the other question, I think, which goes to what a lot of you touched on, is that need to bring people with us on this journey. So whether that is people who are powerful players already, whether it is changes that the public will need to make, but surely isn't that going to slow the process down? And given how urgent it is that we address climate change, how do we get that balance right between doing what we need to do quickly, but making sure it's done in a just way? So they are my two questions. Samantha, we haven't heard from you for a while, so I'm going to come to you on those two questions.
Great, thank you. Well, so on this first question about who will hold governments to account, we will, right? Just transition is an issue for workers, and it's our role as democratic organizations to hold elected officials to account, which we do in different ways. We do it at the ballot box and by mobilizing or not mobilizing for elections. We do it through mobilization on the street. In a lot of countries, that's one of the ways that we will communicate our views about political actions. And we will also sometimes do it together with employers. So for example, in Norway, where I live, the unions and the employers have been demanding measures on just transition and investment from the government in things such as hydrogen production for a while, and now we're going to get it. So those are the ways that we would do this. On your question about, isn't this going to take too much time? I mean, my response, especially to my friends and fellow travelers in the environment movement, is, how is the current strategy working out now, right? Are emissions going down? Do you have broad popular support for aggressive climate action? Or are we running into problems because people fear for their jobs and they fear that they're going to be thrown into unemployment and poverty, or that they will never get a chance to get a formal job because of climate action? Are energy prices so high, with some companies reaping enormous profits because things are working well the way they are? Or would people be more inclined to support the costs of transition if they knew that everyone was paying fair tax and that the money that they're paying is something they can afford, that they can afford energy, and finally that they're not just enriching a few people? I just also want to make one little point about the process of just transition. I mean, we're sometimes talking about two things that are different as if they're the same. So social dialogue is this tripartite discussion between governments, employers, and unions, sometimes informal workers' associations. It's often binding, it's a negotiation. Whereas what we're talking, other panelists have been talking a lot about getting everybody on board and talking to all the stakeholders. That's also important for just transition, but that's not a binding process. It's a multi-stakeholder consultation. And governments need to do both of these things: the binding process, that social dialogue, and then the process of talking to and getting people's views, but not necessarily getting to a binding outcome. So that's just one little thought. Thanks.
Thanks, Samantha. Bernard, I could see you nodding there. I mean, you've worked in policy circles. Do you think governments need holding to account on this? And if you'd like to also answer the question about urgency.
Yeah, I mean, of course they have to be held accountable. I mean, that's the whole idea about democratic societies, that we hold governments accountable for what they do. Sadly, not all our affected countries are so democratic. That's why we need civil society and why we need international organizations, international labor union organizations like Sam just referred to do this in countries where we don't have a strong voice of the people in democracies. I do think that the accountability is not only to governments, but also to shareholders and companies that are really major actors in this transformation. And I think as I said earlier, we have to be very careful on looking what happens there. We have global players in the global arena who do behave, far away from national borders and rule of law of nations, and to get them on board and to convince them that a long-term sustainable investment is only a just investment. That's something where we all have to work together on, and we have to help them accountable as well. Second question on the balance, and I think Sam made a very good entry point there. I always refer that now it's all about speed and scale, right, in this transformation, that we need to speed up to get things done. If we look at the results of our latest trends from the IPCC studies in the last 2 weeks, we know that it's really about speed and scale now. I would add a third aspect with reference to this discussion, that it's also about quality. And to convince, and that's really about what we are discussing in the European Union at the moment, to convince people to follow the leadership in this transformation, we need quality and get people on board to understand that there will not be losers of this development. So it's about speed and scale on the one hand, and to balance this with I would say quality, with equity, with the idea of a just transition is another challenge that we have to face in the next months to come.
Thanks, Bernard. Louise, I can see you nodding there. Did you want to add anything on either the issue of accountability or, getting that balance right in terms of the urgency and the fairness?
Well, I think the two questions are actually somewhat interrelated. I agree very much with Samantha. We will hold governments to account, but I think also the people will hold governments to account. We have seen efforts where governments have tried to put policies in place for just transition, and people have gone out into the streets to complain and to revolt. And so I think that it's going to be really important to bring in the people, as we keep saying, into this process, because they're going to play that key role. But on this challenge you raise, I hear it a lot. Oh, if you do consultations, it's going to slow down the whole process. And we hear it a lot in the bank, in our own infrastructure and projects, where we have procedures under our environmental and social framework to do stakeholder engagement. But what I've also seen in my former job as a country director for the World Bank is that actually those upfront investments in stakeholder engagement and in bringing and understanding the social context actually help the investment go faster down the road. So we look a lot at the technical options. We look a lot at how we're going to, the investments that are needed and the cost, but the process really matters, and putting that process in place from the beginning is critical, with the stakeholders, building capacity of all levels of government and CSOs, engaging early, because we can start now. We don't have to wait for agreements to happen. We know that we have to get out of coal, and we know the timeline to do that. And finally, good communication to make that happen, to bring people on board. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Louise. Sarah, I can see you're busy answering some questions there already online, so I'm going to come to you in a moment. But Sabrina, your thoughts on, do you think the financial institutions are moving quickly enough? Do you think government needs to be doing anything more to kind of get them to move more quickly? And also, any thoughts that you have from the kind of LSE's perspective, the research you're doing on the extent to which you think governments need to be held to account for making sure they do this?
Yeah, so in our view, the private sector is still quite at an early stage when it comes to this. So they get it. They do see that it's an important, and that the just transition is an important thing to support, and that they have a role to play there. But there's not a lot of action yet to back this up, and the right policy framework can really be a contributing factor to further real action on the just transition from the private sector. And it's something we're focusing on very closely in our work on the Financing a Just Transition Alliance in the UK, which consists of over 50 members, mainly banks and investors, but also trade union and local representatives too. And we are coordinating this alliance at the LSE. So at the end of last year, we published our interim report called Just Zero, in which policy was one of the 3 focus themes of the piece, which provided recommendations covering both real economy and financial policies. And within the alliance, we also sent a letter to government ahead of COP26 to call for a step up of just transition policies, so leveraging the collective voice that financial institutions can have in policy dialogue. And in terms of helpful policies to drive ambition and action, a good point to start would be including the just transition in NDCs, nationally determined contributions, ensuring they incorporate impacts on workers, communities, and consumers. South Africa has already made a start here in NDC, for example. Then disclosure requirements can also help to build the needed basis of information for financial institutions to incorporate the just transition in their decision making. And as I mentioned earlier, mandatory transition plans can also play a large role if it becomes common practice for them to address social impacts, which should really be integral to all climate action. And yeah, to be effective, these policies will also need to be backed by credible financial packages then, including phasing out of fossil fuel subsidies and supporting low-income households to address the distributive effect of the transition. The issuance of green and social bonds on the sovereign or also subnational level could also be effective. The UK, for example, has issued its first green gilt in 2021, for which it committed to disclosing the social co-benefits of the project. So first links are being made between the environmental and the social in government debt as well. And of course, as Louise has spoken to, public financial institutions like national or multilateral development banks have a key role to play in providing funding, but also crowding in private finance. So their first efforts are being made, but there's still a lot of room for improvement.
Thanks, Sabrina. Sarah, I'm going to come to you on the next question because I think we've covered that quite a lot, and I'm actually going to pick up one. I think you've messaged back on a couple of these, but I'm going to repeat the question so the audience can hear and give other panel members a chance to answer as well. So again, I'm going to pose two questions because they're both about kind of employee considerations, I think. So one question has come in from Bonnie, and Bonnie says, how does thinking around the just transition include Indigenous traditional knowledge and viewpoints? And I think this goes to what a lot of you said about making sure that all the voices are heard in the room. So that's the first thing. And also I want to ask a specific question. Matt asked the question, how can unions help advocate and support workers to continue to work mobile from home or hybrid to help reduce carbon footprints by travelling by car, something that's very topical at the moment in the UK, this issue of should people be allowed to work in a hybrid way going forward. So maybe Matt's question is more relevant for Samantha. I think you've already answered that, but basically, Sarah, would you like to answer one or both of those? So Indigenous voices and hybrid working.
Thanks, Siobhan, and thanks to Matt and Bonnie for great questions. I've already typed a very extensive answer to Bonnie, so I won't inflict upon you the pain of having me read it out loud as well, but it'd be really great to hear from some of the other panelists in response to Bonnie's question. I guess I want to pick up on Matt's question, and if not necessarily to provide a wholly satisfactory answer on the unions front, which Sam is better placed to answer, but to think about it as part of a system. I think going back to some of the earlier points that were made about the opportunities that a just transition offers, a really good example of this is that car-based cities are not very nice places to live. You know, there's a reason that that the centers of cities like Amsterdam or Barcelona, or perhaps more controversially, New York and London and Sydney are places that the real estate is very expensive because it's very desirable to live near, to have good accessibility to your jobs, to good services, to be able to walk or cycle around in your community, to have very vibrant, dense neighborhoods with a variety of restaurants and retail outlets. This mingling of recreation, leisure and work is often very attractive. And so recognizing that a lot of us don't have the option of working from home and will always need to commute, I think a stronger point is to think about whether through your union or through other mechanisms, you are advocating for a society that does have an emphasis on, at least in urban areas, this livable density with good connectivity, and how you build cities like that are also affordable. Because the biggest downside of very dense cities is that there's a lot of competition for land and house prices go up and they become exclusionary. So I think we have a very related question around what a just urban transition looks like that is low carbon, and that also is a city where people can live who have less well-paid jobs, but have every right to good services, to vibrant communities, and to green space and connectivity.
Thanks, Sarah. Bernard, did you have any thoughts on either, you know, how do we make sure that Indigenous voices and Indigenous knowledge and experience is captured in this process, and any thoughts on hybrid working going forward?
Well, everything is said about hybrid working. I completely agree. That's certainly a privilege of people like us here, and I think I fully agree, my pre-speakers. On the Indigenous question, I have to say I'm not a specialist. I don't know a lot about this. From the very few touch points I had with global companies confronted with these challenges in these countries, I think that we see, and I would love to see, Sam, how you see this from a global workers' union perspective. I see that there is pressure in boardrooms by shareholders and by supervisory boards looking into this, and by global public, often like a sense of urgency about what's happening there. But I'm happy to learn from others here on this highly competent panel on this.
Thanks, Bernard. Well, I'm going to ask Samantha, because I saw that Samantha had answered some of that as well. But Samantha, your thoughts on one or both of those issues, Indigenous voices and the future of hybrid working?
Yeah, well, to start with the second one first, because that's a pretty straightforward question. That's something that is and should be collectively bargained, right? So where there's an opportunity for people to work from home, I hope that the person asking the question is a union member. That's something that unions actually do negotiate. And we also negotiate things like, does your employer have to make sure that you have proper seating and lighting and equipment at home? And also, how much electronic surveillance can they use on you while you're working from home? That was more of a question during the pandemic, when everyone who could had to work from home because of government rules. So my advice, join a union, make sure it's in your collective bargaining negotiations. And one other thing that can be in collective bargaining is actually workplace emissions. So for those of you who are public servants, you can negotiate plans with your employer, the state, for the overall emissions, including things like commuting. You can also negotiate supports for using public transport. That's a pretty common thing that employers also do. On the question of the rights of Indigenous peoples and how, or it was really more about traditional knowledge and how that's reflected in a just transition process, it really depends on the country, right? Because as we all know, while we have UN conventions on the rights of Indigenous peoples, we also have countries that are either aren't party to those conventions or not implementing them. They're not recognizing the rights of Indigenous peoples to their culture, traditional knowledge, but also to some pretty key things like land and resources. So generally about traditional knowledge, that would come in, depending on the country, that would come in this broad process we talked about of multi-stakeholder consultation, where one part of that consultation, maybe a separate consultation, would be with First Nations or Indigenous and tribal peoples. If people have sovereignty, so if you have a country like Greenland or Canada, Nunavut, where people have sovereignty because Indigenous peoples have sovereignty, then they're the state. Yeah. Right. So in a social dialogue process, then they would be there either as the state or side by side with the what shall I say, the settler state. But in most countries, in this other part of the process, the consultation process.
Thanks, Samantha. We've got loads of questions coming in, so I do want to move on. But Louise, given where you have worked previously, did you want to add anything on the issue of Indigenous voices and experience?
No, just to say that, first of all, I totally agree with Samantha that they're part of the discussion of stakeholder engagement, very critical to that. Very critical also on the adaptation side, which we're not focusing on, and where they're involved in community-led adaptation efforts, building often on traditional interventions. Then also I just wanted to highlight the Escazú Agreement, which was passed last year in Latin America, which is about access to information on environmental. It's an environmental treaty, the first of its kind, and recognizes human rights and the defenders of the environment. So we're looking to support its implementation because it is quite an innovative treaty. And then finally, the World Bank also works with, and many donors as well, who support trust funds that engage with Indigenous communities on carbon sequestration in forests, and efforts to support local efforts of mitigation and adaptation through a variety of trust funds. So they are very much part of our work on climate. Just wanted to highlight that.
Thanks, Louise. There's another question here, Louise, that actually came from, I think, prompted by your presentation. So it's from Barry, and he said, Louise hinted at what I think is the most fundamental question when she spoke of the technical challenges in transition. My question to the panelists is, transition to what? Is it new generation nuclear power hydrogen as a fuel. Louise, did you want to comment on that one first?
So that's outside my area of technical expertise. I will say the World Bank is supporting heavily the renewable sector, so wind, solar in particular, and that's where we see most of the growth happening, perhaps some in nuclear, and in the short term in natural gas, but very short term.
Thanks, Louise. Sabrina, I'm going to ask you that question because you mentioned obviously financial institutions and where they might choose to invest going forward. So do you have any thoughts on kind of the transition to what's going to be the big kind of areas going forward?
Yeah, I would like to relate it to that. I'm not sure if it 100% answers the question, so please come back to me if I don't. But I would like to kind of pick up on the point that Bernhard mentioned about the cost of living crisis and the energy price spike linked to the war in Ukraine, because I think before that happened, implicitly, a lot of the conversation around the net zero transition has assumed we need to go from the current stable state of the economy to a net zero one, which will need to design to be at least as stable. But I think what the cost of living crisis has really illustrated is that the current state of the energy system is not stable, and even unrelated to climate change, there are important changes that need to be made in order to ensure that energy prices stay at a level where vulnerable people can still afford their energy costs. So that's one key. I think one key thing that's been highlighted by this war, and that's going to be one direction of travel in this net zero transition.
Thanks, Sabrina. Bernhard, from your experience working, as you say, with Green parties and others, what do you think the transition is to? What do you think are going to be the new big kind of energy alternatives?
What do you expect me to say? I do think that Louisa was right that, and I like the World Bank policy in this field, particularly in the last 3-4 years, Louisa, let me say this, that we heavily look into the field of renewables as this solution midterm, and that we see gas really as a very, very short interim resource. I think you get different answers in different countries, right? Our French friends, our friends in the US have some certain dreams about nuclear futures. I have an opinion about this, but let all the flowers bloom. I mean, the most important thing is that we get out of the carbon very, very fast. I do think, though, that as I said before, that Germany, in many respects, again, is a laboratorium for this transition. And we are ahead of the curve, not only in our numbers, but also in this very progressive new administration that has very, very serious plans for this country, with very ambitious agendas by 2030 and 2045, becoming carbon neutral. And that brings with it a broad societal consensus that we have to invest, and that will change the way we live and we do produce, and the way we travel, and the way our daily life will be. And I think we have to carefully observe where that leads us. And I'm very confident that particularly the transition into a renewable future in the field of energy will make a major impact in this field.
Thanks, Bernhard. There's a question coming, which I think in some ways kind of it encapsulates everything we are trying to cover here. And the question is from Milton. I see there's a couple of answers that have been typed, but it would be good if everybody could hear the answers to this. So Milton has asked, the rich countries at the top and poor countries at the bottom. So for example, in Haiti, they have the necessities of life as their goal. In Germany, it's return on shares. Isn't the needs and effort of top and bottom a problem to achieve the same goals? And I think this goes to the real heart of the just transition. So Samantha, I'm going to come back to you. Just your thoughts on, such different stages that countries are at. How can we actually achieve this transition in a just way, given those huge differences?
Well, I think it's probably good to think about it in two ways, and certainly to work on it in two ways, which is what we do, right? So on the one hand, just transition is going to be quite different in Haiti or in South Africa with, 46% unemployment, the world's highest inequality, than it's going to be in Germany, as we've heard from Bernard. But the principles are the same, but exactly how much investment you need, where that investment goes, maybe to some extent, what your goals are. In South Africa, for example, our affiliates, unions are asking for a job multiplier. So it's not enough to just replace a single job in coal with a job in mining something else, or in mine remediation. You actually need to create 5 to 10 jobs for every formal job that disappears. So that would be one way to think about this, is that obviously, you're not going to have exactly the same outcomes from social dialogue or from the discussion with stakeholders in one country as in another. And then internationally, we're calling for a lot of things, and maybe this is a good opportunity to put them forward. One is that, first of all, we want a universal floor of labor rights, so that in fact, we do take some steps towards everyone having rights at work and rights to social protection, rights to safety at work. Two, we've also called for a global fund for social protection. So that's something that's gotten some traction in different international processes, but that would be where especially wealthy countries are contributing to a global fund that would then be supporting social protection in least developed countries. Third, there were some steps at Glasgow, as a couple of people have talked about. There was an agreement, declaration signed by some of the biggest donors of climate finance, committing to the ILO Just Transition Guidelines and to climate finance for just transition that would in fact be focused on creating good jobs for people. And so that's a sort of third way that you bring these things into, things into the sort of same harmonious space. But I guess the last thing is really about tax, right? So there's a reason why some countries are poor and other countries are less poor. And the reason isn't, sort of this country was good and this country was bad. It's also about extraction of resources and a failure by multinationals to pay tax. You need a tax base in order to implement a just transition. I see Louise is nodding. And so without that, you're going to be sort of trying to scrape together money from different sources, but you need this base of public and fair tax and public investment in order to get a just transition everywhere.
Thanks, Samantha. I'm just looking at the time and I can't believe how fast the time has gone. So we're probably just going to have to do one final round picking up on this issue of Milton's question, but also just to say to the audience, thank you so much for sending in so many great questions. If we haven't managed to answer them all, we'll make sure they get answered behind the scenes after we finish the webinar. And also there will be a questionnaire in your inboxes. Please do take a couple of minutes to answer that. It just makes sure that we can give you the webinars that are most useful to you. So I would be hugely grateful if you could do that for us. So now just the last opportunity to hear from our panelists. I'm going to ask each of you very quickly, probably no more than a minute each, just to give me your thoughts on Milton's question around, kind of Haiti versus Germany, that issue, or if you would rather, as you've all mentioned, the potential for backlash, given how much change needs to happen, do you think governments could be doing more to make the case for change and just raise awareness of how big some of these changes are going to need to be? So you can answer one or both of those. Sabrina, I'm going to come to you first.
Thanks a lot. So I think Samantha has spoken to the first question really, really well. And just to add to that, there's multilateral cooperation will be key in achieving a just transition. And the question speaks a lot to climate justice as well, right? the role that high-income countries versus low-income countries have had in the past in kind of greenhouse gas emissions and the climate change that we've already produced. So it's only fair that there are also multilateral financial solutions that provide support there. And it was a huge disappointment at COP26 that the 100 billion goal was not reached. And there's a huge need for this to step up in order to achieve a just transition.
Thanks, Sabrina. Sarah, to you on either of these issues.
Thanks, Siobhan. I guess, although we didn't use the word just transition, I think that some of the key principles that we've talked about today emerged in the earliest forms of the climate accords, which is to say this idea that countries have common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities to respond to climate change. And I think that fully recognizes that difference between Haiti and Germany and any other countries. I guess I wanted to reiterate that a just transition is not something that we can necessarily achieve technocratically. We can talk all we want about funds and multilateral systems and formal planning and net zero legal commitments, and all of those are important to secure the gains that have been made. But I think we need to be honest that a just transition is not in the interests of powerful groups. And in fact, a transition is not in the interest of powerful groups unless it's done that they maintain their power. A just transition is going to have to be done because people who are at risk are fighting for something better. And of course, we have seen the labor movement do that for many years, but there are a number of other groups who are going to have to be a part of this and work together across traditional boundaries. So just to say that in the end, I think a recognition of the importance of creating space for their voices to be heard, of being an ally to them, is something we can do personally beyond our jobs as researchers, civil servants, bureaucrats, whatever our particular titles might be. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sarah. Bernard, you were nodding your head a lot when Sarah was talking there.
Yeah, I mean, Sarah's brilliant, I said, and I fully agree. And I like the point about capabilities and responsibilities of governments. And I think this is very much the core of what we can expect now by each of the government that we are looking at. And I'm happy that people like Sam and Sarah and others from their researchers or unions perspective are really observing them and taking them responsibility and accountable for this. And I'm very much confident that we will see lots of good things happening in policy making at the moment, but I think at the same time we need the pressure both from civil society groups and from all us here on the panel to keep it on the right track and keep the eyes on the prize. Thank you.
Thanks, Bernard. Louise, did you want to add any further?
Yes, I did. Thank you. First of all, just to say on the multilateral side, the World Bank's committed to providing 35% of its overall financing for climate, and half of that going to adaptation. So we're trying, it's a key central priority of the institution at the moment. But I want to make one final point, which is the Haiti and Germany point. Yes, we need societies to be socially cohesive to make the right decisions. And that's part of social sustainability. I don't think we can count on electing the right governments if we don't have socially sustained to make the right decisions. I don't think we can count on collecting the taxes from corporations and from rich people unless we have these socially sustainable societies, which means you have a connection between people, you have citizen engagement, a trust between government and every society, and between, I could go on, I'm trying to be quite brief, rule of law. These are all critical dimensions. So it's in a broader context that we all need to see that addressing climate change is going to be in our mutual interest. I don't think we can just count on governments or multilaterals or the people most directly impacted. We need to build those links, and it's through broader policies for stronger societies.
Thanks, Louise. Really hammering home some of those messages that come out throughout the conversation. Thank you. Samantha, we started with you. I'm going to give you the final thoughts. Anything that you would like to add before we have to close?
No, my fellow panelists have said a lot of eloquent things about the need to fight. So I'll just say this. I mean, when we don't get the governments that we want or the policies that we need without organizing and fighting for them. And we don't get the delivery of the things we need, including from political decisions, without organizing and fighting for them. And that is true everywhere, also in very well-developed democracies. So we're always up for that in the labor movement. is to work on the international level to try to get some of these structures that we will then also try to get through mobilizing, organizing, and even hitting the streets.
Thank you so much, Samantha. Well, unfortunately, our time is up. I've been doing these webinars for quite a long time now for Global Government Forum, and I have to say this has been one of the most enjoyable webinars that I've done, and that is down to having such a fantastic panel. So I would like to say a huge thanks to all of you, to Sabrina, to Bernard, to Sarah, to Louise, to Samantha, for sharing your expertise with us. We started by saying there's no bigger policy challenge, but just to hear you talk about it in that way, that not only can we build a greener future, we can build a fairer future, I think is such an inspirational message for all of us. Thank you very much to all of you. To the audience, we will be sending round a link with the video of this webinar so you can share it with your colleagues and friends. You can watch it all over again if you want to. And we will also be sharing a link to an article in a couple of weeks with the key points that came out from the discussion. Thank you to the panel, to the audience, to Deloitte for being our knowledge partner. And I look forward to seeing you all again soon in a webinar, hopefully very soon. Thanks everybody. Enjoy the rest of the day wherever you are. Bye-bye.